Would you like to live a blessed life? There are plenty of people today talking about blessing. They tend to throw about the word blessed. But what does true blessing look like? Maybe you're a Christian, but you don't feel particularly blessed tonight. And perhaps you wonder if you're doing it wrong. Is the Christian life supposed to look like this? Maybe especially during this year of pandemic, you wonder, is God's blessing on hold? Well, the opening verse of our section tonight, verse 12, contains the phrase, "The Lord blessed him." The Lord blessed him. But what did that mean for Isaac? Did it mean that things always went well for him? Did it mean that he never experienced conflict? Did it mean that he always felt a warm glow inside? Well, actually, what we have in this chapter is a snapshot of the Christian life. And it is a blessed life. The greatest, the most blessed life that there is. But that doesn't mean there aren't challenges. That doesn't mean there aren't ups and downs. We still sin, and we're still sinned against. We still experience frustrations. And yet, it is the ultimate blessed life, the only truly blessed life. So what is the blessed life? We have three headings tonight, and our first one is to be a Christian is to be blessed because of the obedience of another. Maybe if you've stumbled across this and you don't know much about the Bible, you don't know much about church, well, this sums a lot of it up. To be a Christian is to be blessed because of the obedience of another. At first glance, Genesis 26 doesn't seem too relevant to life in 2021 there. Digging wells, disputes with herdsmen, treaties with foreign kings. It all seems 1,000 miles from the very real and very pressing concerns of our day-to-day lives. And yet, if God really is unchanging, as we thought about last week, and if human nature doesn't change, then behind an outer layer that seems quite foreign to us, we're not surprised to find that the core issues here are exactly the same as the sort of things that we face. And it's not just that God's character doesn't change, but how God works is fundamentally the same. Old Testament, New Testament, how God works in the world, it's fundamentally the same. Externally, differences, yes, but at the root of it, it's the same. And so in Romans, you get Paul stressing that Isaac's father, Abraham, was saved by faith, just like us, not by works. And here we're being taught another principle, and that is that Isaac is blessed because of the obedience of another, and so are we. Our section begins in verse 12 by telling us that God blessed Isaac. But why did he bless him? Well, it can't be because of Isaac's obedience. Because as we saw last week, Isaac responded badly to God's promise at the start of the chapter. Isaac is just fresh from lying about his wife, pretending she's a sister, and putting the whole covenant line in jeopardy. And he's just joined the list of Bible characters. It's a list you really don't want to be on, of people like Jonah who've been rebuked for their sin by pagans. There have been people like the sailors in Jonah who threw him overboard, and now like Abimelech here who are showing more righteousness than those who are meant to be God's people. Yes, Isaac obeyed God's command in verse 2 not to go down to Egypt, but then he failed spectacularly. So even if we weren't told anything else about the reason for God's blessing, it can't be because of Isaac's obedience, which is half-hearted at best. But in fact, we are told the reason for God's blessing of him. Why did God bless Isaac? Verse 24. And the Lord appeared to him that same night and said, I am the God of Abraham your father. Fear not, for I am with you, and will bless you and multiply you for my servant Abraham's sake. And what had Abraham done? Well, back up in verse 5, we're told that blessing is coming on all the nations of the earth because Abraham obeyed. Now, as we saw last week, even Abraham's obedience is only because of God's grace. None of this is contradicting what Paul says in Romans about Abraham being saved by faith. But the emphasis on Abraham's obedience in this passage reinforces the principle that blessing comes to Isaac because of the obedience of another. And that is absolutely not the way that we as human beings expect things to work. We think that we will stand or fall before God based on our own obedience. That's the default human assumption. But if you believe that, you will be lost for all eternity. And you will be lost whether you think you're good enough for God or whether you realize that you're not. If you think that you stand or fall before God based on your own obedience, and if you think you are able to obey, well, then you'll be lost because you're actually not able, and your obedience will never cut it. Romans 3:20, for by the works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight. But on the other side of the coin, if you realize that you're not good enough, and yet if you still think that you stand or fall before God based on your own obedience, then you have no hope because you think, well, I've fallen and that's the way it has to go. And so what humbling news and what glorious news the gospel is when it says that we're saved by the obedience of another, Jesus Christ. We're not saved by our obedience, but we're saved by Jesus' obedience in our place. He is the one who succeeded where we failed. And that is humbling news for those who think they're good enough to stand before God based on the merits of their own obedience. But it is life-giving news for those who've already realized that they could never stand before God based on their own obedience. And that's not just true for the start of the Christian life, but it's true the whole way through. It's not that we're saved by grace, but then we continue by works. Rather, at every stage of the Christian life, our standing before God is based on the obedience of another, Jesus Christ. When you go to bed tonight, your standing before God isn't based on how well you've obeyed God today. Your standing before God as you shut your eyes tonight is based on what Jesus Christ has done. And whoever among us, whoever has had the best day, a real day where they felt really close to God, and someone else at the other end of the scale might felt completely distant from God today, but our standing before God equally, for either person, it's based on what Jesus has done. Once we start thinking that we stand or fall based on our own obedience, we're in trouble because it will inevitably lead to either pride or despair. If we think it's based on us, it'll either lead to pride if we think we've done enough, or despair when we realize we haven't. So firstly, tonight, to be a Christian is to be blessed based on the obedience of another. That is the foundation of our blessing. That is the foundation of the blessed life. But then secondly, blessed people still face trials. Blessed people still face trials. When people share photos and they talk about how blessed they are on social media, it's usually not a picture of them suffering. Do suffering and blessing go together? We probably assume that they don't. Does going through trials prove that someone isn't really being blessed by God? Well, here in verses 12 and 13, we read about God's tremendous blessing on Isaac. It's the sort of thing that a health and wealth preacher would have a field day with. And Isaac sowed in the land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. The Lord blessed him, and the man became rich and gained more and more until he became very wealthy. He had possessions of flocks and herds and many servants. It sounds brilliant. It sounds like an ideal life. But how does verse 14 end? so that the Philistines envied him. In verse 15 we read that the Philistines had tried to undo some of the work that Abraham had done. And in verse 16, King Abimelech literally tells Isaac to go away. You can't preach a health and wealth gospel, even from the lives of some of the wealthiest people in the Old Testament. Never mind the New, when the emphasis on God's blessing moves further away from material things. But blessed people still face trials. Trials and suffering don't mean that you've missed out on God's blessing. You can be living under a trial and living under God's blessing at the very same time. So how does Isaac react to the opposition that he faces? When Abimelech tells him to go away, what does Isaac do? He goes away. Then in verse 17 he moves to the valley of Gerar. He and his servants dig some wells, find a spring of water, but there's more quarrelling. Then they dig another well, there's more quarrelling. And so in verse 22 he moves on again. So what are we to make of Isaac in this chapter? Does he need to develop a bit of a backbone? Is he just being a bit weak here? Letting himself be shoved around by others, not asserting his rights? Well, I think that what we see here isn't weakness, but meekness. They sound the same, but they're very different. Meekness isn't weakness. Meekness is strength under control. It's choosing not to allow yourself to be provoked. The fact that Abraham and Isaac have been promised the land by God, that meant that they didn't have to feel the pressure to take matters into their own hands. Rather than try to fight for the land now, they waited in faith until the time that God would give it to them. Believing in a sovereign God means that we don't have to take matters into our own hands if we think that God's being a bit slow about it. Whether it's because of something that God has promised, like it is here, or whether it's because we know that God is judge, we can entrust things to Him and we can wait for His timing. Now, there are times when it is right to claim our rights. At times the Apostle Paul did it, at times he didn't. At times he said, I'm a Roman citizen, what are you doing? At other times he didn't. But as children of a sovereign God, we should be a lot more ready than we probably are just to leave things with Him. In The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, those who were oppressed under the reign of the White Witch took confidence in the fact that wrong will be right when Aslan comes in sight. In other words, when the deliverer comes, everything will be put right. And believing in a God who will do that means that we don't always have to try and take matters into our own hands. And it also saves us from bitterness and despair about situations that we're powerless to change. Believing that God will one day put all things to right means that we can play the long game. We can trust God to resolve situations in His time. We can trust that He can still work even after we're gone. Isaac isn't passive here. He's not a pushover. In verse 18, he gives the wells the names that Abraham had given him. That's a claim of ownership. In verse 27, Isaac is blunt and direct to Abimelech when he now comes wanting a covenant. Isaac asks him, why have you come to me, saying that you hate me and have sent me away from you? He's not a pushover, but he is meek. Meekness often looks like weakness to the world. But knowing that God is in control means that we don't always have to force our way. We don't always have to try and get the last word in. And of course, Isaac, the meek man in this chapter, points us forward to the ultimate meek man, the Lord Jesus Christ. The one who was fully God and had infinite strength, and yet laid aside his rights for our sake. So firstly, to be a Christian is to be blessed because of the obedience of another. Secondly, blessed people still face trials. But then thirdly, by God's blessing, we should expect to see fruit. By God's blessing, we should expect to see fruit. What if we do face opposition? Does entrusting things to God and playing the long game mean giving up any expectation of fruitfulness in our work in the kingdom? Not at all. The period of Isaac's life described in these verses isn't easy, but by his persistence and through God's blessing, he makes progress. What's Isaac trying to achieve through all this moving about and well digging and so on? Well, he's trying to see fruitfulness. Look at the end of verse 22. For now the Lord has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land. And as Christians, we are to seek to be fruitful by the blessing of God. John chapter 15 is a hugely important chapter for understanding what we as Christians are to be doing in the world. And what the church's role is as well in equipping Christians. Maybe I'll come back and preach a sermon on it before too long. But in that chapter, John 15, the Lord Jesus says, "By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples." In fact, he says, "Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away." So as a believer in Jesus Christ, you are to be bearing fruit for God. And by His grace, you will be bearing fruit for God. People debate whether the fruit is the fruit of the Spirit or the fruit of conversions to Christ. And I don't think we have to choose between one or the other. But we can say that by God's grace, we are to be having a gospel impact. Now, in line with 1 Corinthians 12, which I referred to this morning, that won't look the same for everyone. We have different roles to play, just like there are different parts of the body with different functions. But could our lives as Christians be described as fruitful? Is there growth in our own lives? And is there impact in the lives of others? Whether that's impact in terms of building up believers or impact in terms of bringing the gospel to unbelievers. Richard Sibbes, the Puritan, says of Christians, "It is not enough to be good in ourselves, but our goodness must flow out." So whatever way we define fruitfulness, we can't define it in such a way that it doesn't impact on the lives of other people. The fruit of the Spirit, remember, we can only live them when we're with other people. We can't live out the fruit of the Spirit in solitary confinement. It's not enough to be good in ourselves, but our goodness must flow out. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about fruitfulness. So is there goodness flowing out of us, impacting our families, our churches, and our community? We can apply this both as individuals and as churches. Obviously, the two things are closely related because churches won't be fruitful unless the individuals in those churches are fruitful. But churches themselves should expect to see fruit. And if they don't, they should ask hard questions. And I want to particularly highlight this word fruitfulness tonight because it is possible for churches, particularly Reformed churches, to hide their lack of fruitfulness behind the word faithfulness. Yes, of course, we're to be faithful. If we're not faithful, we'll not bear any real lasting fruit. But it can so easily just become an excuse. Yes, we're not seeing much happening, but at least we're being faithful. Last week I quoted an article entitled "Against Evangelical Pessimism," and I'm going to quote another part of it tonight because it's just so good. I think the author really puts his finger on the attitude of many in Reformed churches in Scotland and elsewhere. He says, "Too often ministers and churches sink into a malaise. After all, everything is in decline, and a sure sign of our faithfulness must be that nothing ever happens, and there is no hope that anything ever will." Amazingly, he's saying, and this is an author who's travelled about a lot and spoke at many different churches, many different conferences. He's got a good handle on the church in the UK. And he's saying that there are churches where the fact that nothing ever happens is actually seen as a sign of faithfulness. Whereas if good things are happening in a church down the road, if it's growing, then there must be something suspicious about that. And this biblical category of fruitfulness is ignored. Now, churches go through different seasons. Fruitfulness for churches as well looks different just as it does for individuals. I think we even see that in Isaac here, this season in Isaac's life. He's restoring some of the wells that Abraham has dug. We could call it a work of revitalization, though he's also trying to branch out into new territory as well. But there should be fruitfulness. In fact, I think we can see another connection to the New Testament in our passage in verse 12. And Isaac sowed in the land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. By God's blessing, there is a sowing and then a reaping of 100-fold. Does that remind you of anything? Well, surely it reminds us of the parable of the sower, Mark 4, verse 8. And other seed fell into good soil and produced grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30-fold and 60-fold and 100-fold. So in light of the whole Bible, I don't think we can read Genesis 26 without applying it to gospel fruitfulness. Is Genesis 26 here to teach us about well digging and farming? I don't think so. It's here because ultimately Isaac was engaged in the same work that we are engaged in. What's Isaac doing in this chapter? Well, he's living by faith that one day God will give them this land, and he's working towards that day when God's people will be in God's place under God's rule and blessing. That's what Israel had in the promised land. That's what the patriarchs like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob looked forward to, and that's what we have in heaven. It'll be God's people in God's place under God's rule and blessing. Now, Isaac's fruitfulness doesn't occur overnight. It's a slow process. There's a lot of plodding going on, a lot of digging and moving about until finally he can say in verse 22, "For now the Lord has made room for us, and we will be fruitful in the land." Even then, a lot of the fruitfulness that he talks about is still ahead. And so when we talk about fruitfulness, we're not talking about overnight success. There aren't any shortcuts to fruitfulness for us either, whether as individuals or as churches. This week, Paul Levy, who's a minister in London, shared a letter to his congregation entitled "The Slowness of God." He talked about an older minister he knew who came over from America and who had 18 months left before he retired. And in that time, he hoped to see a church planted in the UK. He came, he delivered tens of thousands of leaflets, he knocked on thousands of doors, he did a lot of sowing, and yet he went home disappointed that there was only a small work left behind as a result. And yet 15 years later, that work is still there, that church is still there. Now, this isn't just a UK v America thing, though it is maybe helpful to remember not to compare ourselves to other countries where there are more churches, more people, more Christians. But wherever we are in the world, God's ways will often seem slow to us. What's Paul's charge to Timothy in 2 Timothy 4? Preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season. Reprove, rebuke, exhort with great patience and instruction. What's striking about that is how undramatic it all is. Paul tells Timothy, keep on going, don't drift, don't give up, keep these priorities. Levy says in his letter to his congregation, I want to encourage us as a church to slow-going, faith-filled, expectant plodding, knowing that God promises that there will be a great harvest. And I think that beautifully catches the emphases of the New Testament. The kingdom parables tell us that things will be slow going, that it will start small, that it will look unimpressive, but that one day there will be a great harvest, and yet in between it will not look very spectacular. And in this chapter 2, things don't happen overnight. Isaac has to go through his fair share of grief, and yet he keeps plodding. And by God's blessing, he's fruitful in the long run. And so let me encourage us as a church to slow-going, faith-filled, expectant plodding, knowing that God promises there will be a harvest. And just as we draw things to a close, some of that fruit may come even from those who have initially opposed us, even from some of those who have been a cause of trials for us. Now, I'm not claiming that the Philistines are converted by the end of the chapter, but there's definitely a change in their attitude. Maybe it's just purely cynical. Maybe their attitude is just, well, if we can't beat him, we better join him. But certainly by the end of the chapter, they've come to admit that God is with Isaac. Verse 28, they said, we see plainly that the Lord has been with you. Now, deep down, they probably knew that already back in verse 15 when we read that they envied him. They probably already knew that God was with him, they just didn't want to admit it. For all that the world likes to mock Christians, behind it there can often be a sense of envy. They can envy our certainty, a certainty about life after death, a certainty about right and wrong. Perhaps they envy the consistency of our lives as well, when they see that we're not just living a certain way when others are watching. As the jealous Babylonian officials knew was the case with Daniel, they just couldn't find anything on him. He was so consistent, and that just made them even angrier. No matter how much they might want to deny that God is with Isaac, eventually the Philistines have to admit it. And in that way, we see Proverbs 16:7 in action. When a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies be at peace with him. When a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies be at peace with him. Maybe there's someone in your life and you just can't imagine them ever being at peace with you. But if you're consistent, if you consistently don't rise to their provocation, perhaps if you're there for them in a time of need, over time you may well see their attitude begin to change. What a verse to pray for them as well. Proverbs 16:7, that God would make even them be at peace with us, and even more than that, a peace that is a gospel peace. Just as we finish tonight, I've been struck the last couple of weeks how the attribute of God that we've looked at in the morning is illustrated by the passage that we're due to look at in the evening, and it's the same again today. This morning we were looking at God as the source of all life outside of himself. I didn't quote it, but this is how the Westminster Confession summarizes it. God has all life, glory, goodness, blessedness in and of himself, and is alone in and unto himself all-sufficient, not standing in need of any creatures which he has made, nor deriving any glory in, by, unto, and upon them. And particularly, hear those opening words. God has all life, glory, goodness, blessedness in and of himself. So, do you want a blessed life? Or where will you find it? Well, the answer is obvious. You'll find it the closer you are to the source of all blessedness. Surely the closer that we live to the one who is the source of all blessedness, then the more blessing we will know. Yes, he will lead you through trials, and that doesn't mean that you're not blessed by him. Yes, He may not change situations as fast as you'd like. We do have to struggle with patience at times. Yes, there will be times when it doesn't look like there's a lot happening, maybe seasons in our lives as individuals, seasons in church life, where it doesn't seem that there's much happening. But what's the alternative? Well, very sadly, we see the alternative in the last two verses of the chapter. To go away from God, as Esau does in those last two verses, is to go away from your only hope of true and lasting blessing. And of course, we should never really see that word blessed without thinking of the alternative. What's the alternative to blessing? It's curse. That's all we deserve for all eternity. Cursed is everyone who does not obey the works of the law. And yet, we who have not obeyed the works of the law, we are blessed and we will be blessed for all eternity, because Jesus Christ came to make His blessings flow far as the curse is found. Amen. Well, we're going to close by singing a psalm which speaks about the blessing for all who fear the Lord. And remembering as we sing that word blessing that the opposite of to be blessed is to be cursed. And that is what we deserve. And yet there is blessing here for all who fear the Lord. There are pictures of blessing in the psalm which don't apply to everyone, at least in the same way, though they do apply to the family of the church. But all who fear the Lord are blessed. And ultimately, we will have the blessing if we stay close to the source of blessing, if we plod on for Him, if we expect the harvest, then we will have the blessing in verse 4 of seeing Jerusalem prosper, seeing the church prosper all the days till life will cease, and we will see children's children, whether that is physically or spiritually, those that we have impacted for the gospel. So what a song that we can sing. Truly we are blessed people. Psalm 128, let's praise God.